Well, welcome. I am so glad that you took the opportunity to join us here on our discussion on confronting injustice and racism. My name is Pastor Matt Peoples. I am a pastor of a local congregation, also the founder director of the Kairos Network and host of Life, a Church Planter. And in this webinar series, we've been trying to address a lot of the issues that have been coming up lately that churches and pastors have had to deal with. And when everything started coming out I don't want to say coming out as if it wasn't there, but there's been a real burden around the issues of injustice and racism that we have seen lately. And I think as a church leader, I feel a burden to say, how do we talk about this well with our congregation? How do we address these issues so the church isn't silent at a time when the church is critically needed? And that's why I'm so glad that I have Dr. John Nunes on speed dial. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing great, thanks. Great to be here with you today, Matt. Thanks.
I'm just so excited to have this conversation with you today because you have opened my eyes more than I think anybody else to how we look at issues of injustice and racism from a Christ-centered, scripture-centered perspective. And you have opened my eyes to things I was completely unaware of. But when you open up the scriptures, you have me understanding on a deeper level what the gospel means, especially when I'm addressing these issues of injustice and racism. And so, when I was thinking, who could I ask the hard questions? who could I have this really difficult conversation with? You were the first person that came to mind. So thank you so much for being willing to have this conversation with us today.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I really am impressed with the work of the Kairos Network, even in daring to tackle a really tough topic, and for stepping out there in faith and bringing people together, convening people so that we can grapple with this, as you say, through this Christ-centered lens.
Well, and I tell you what, I think grapple is really the right word for it, because we've done a bunch of webinars. This is probably the webinar that we've put the most preparation into because it's just that important. And, John, in our conversations back and forth, I think we landed on a really great format for today because as somebody wrestling with these issues myself, I think the best place to start is to just be able to listen. So in this webinar, what we're going to do is we're going to have some time just to listen to John. Talk about these issues that he spent a lifetime walking through and sharing with the church. And then we're going to have opportunities for Q&A and chat. So let me tell you how that works. If you're watching on Facebook right now, we have a link, so you can't send in Q&A. We'll try to deal with comments later. But if you want to send in a question, you got to get on the Zoom call or on the webinar, send it into the Q&A. So if you send your questions into the Q&A, we'll be able to see those. And then if you have chat stuff, we're going to put any links we're talking about in the chat. But if you have a question you want addressed, throw it in the Q&A. We might not have time for all the questions, but we will do our best to address them. And so that's kind of how the format will work. And then, of course, remember, we're all trying to figure this out. So be respectful of those that are on the webinar with you. And if you're not sure, just ask the question. And if it's out of bounds, we just won't address it if that's fair. But I think you're going to find that this is going to be a really unfiltered and honest conversation. So, John, if you would, please just take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to go to screen share now. And of course, we're all learning how to work all of these various functions. So just be patient with me, please. And I really do appreciate the opportunity to do a deep dive. Appreciate the opportunity to zoom out here on Zoom and to get some content. I'm going to go very fast through this content at first, and then hopefully after about 30 minutes, we can slow down a bit and unpack some of the content in terms of questions. So I want to start with a little bit of my own personal story and how I sort of became aware of some of these questions and these issues and these challenges. So I was born in Montego Bay, Jamaica on January 14th, 1963. And that, by the way, was the same day that in the United States of America on January 14th, 1963, there was a new governor in the state of Alabama, and he was being inaugurated. His name is George Wallace. And during his inauguration address, he said, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. That's just an interesting historical coincidence. George Wallace, of course, was the governor of Alabama, where my wife was born, in Selma, Alabama, which in many ways is the cradle of the civil rights movement. I moved then to Canada from Jamaica, from Jamaica where it's nice and warm to Canada where it's not so nice and warm. And that's where we became Lutheran. And we went to a Lutheran church in Canada, in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And then at 18 years old, in 1981, I went to Concordia College in Ann Arbor, Michigan. My second day on campus, the registrar for the school handed me a census form that I had to fill out. And under the ethnicity category, it had the following places where I could check the box. The first was Black. So my father is Afro-Jamaican, very Black, very proud, Marcus Garvey. So I checked that box. The next category was White. My mother is Scottish, Highland, see-through white. I mean, very white. And so I checked that box because you got to be what your mother is, right? You come from your mother, so you must be what she is. So I checked that box. The next category was Spanish surnamed. So our last name is Nunes, which is actually a Portuguese name. Portugal, Spain, they border each other. And Spanish surnamed was the term at the time that was used to describe Hispanics. By the way, think about this. Nobody is a Hispanic until they move to the United States of America. Before that, you're Peruvian or Mexican or whatever it is that you are. Then you can come here and you get like lumped into this big category called Hispanic. But nonetheless, we've actually have no idea how we got this name. We've actually done research and I found out that the name is Sephardic Jewish, but that was not on the form. So I couldn't check that, but I did check the Spanish surname box. And then there was something like the only unchecked category was Asian Pacific Islander Hawaiian. And then finally, there was a category called international student. So I thought Jamaican born, Canadian raised, living in the US, that's international. I had about 8 boxes checked under one category by the time I got done. The next day, the registrar came up to me, he had his bow tie tied, obviously far too tight. And he said, there's no way you can be all of this. He says, he had an apoplectic fit. He said, you're skewing my data. Can you please just be one thing? Which is really sad. Why does a person have to get reduced into one kind of category? Why can't a person be who God made them to be? I mean, if child of God was on that form, I would have checked that box. But he said, you got to be one thing. So that was the day I like to say that I became Black, whatever that means, okay? Because I became a category that was sort of artificially designated by this person in the United States of America. Okay, so I'll be Black. A couple weeks later, I started with, since I was at a Lutheran school, there were about 6 Black students. So I started a Black students organization, and we actually led a petition to have a walkout on Martin Luther King Day. He was really sorry he made me Black. But that's kind of a story that has kind of shaped my identity. These are my parents, and they are heroes to me. They had a heroic love. Their marriage, when they got married, would have been considered illegal in many states of the United States of America. My father died 6 days before I became president of Concordia College, New York. But what an impossible blessing they were to me. My mother is now 75 years old and living still in Canada. And they defied these kind of racial categories because they believed that there was one thing, one race, and it was called human. And obviously there was, because they actually could mate together. I was born 9 months after they were married, and they're sticking to that story. But they're not of different species. They're of the same species. The very fact that they can
John,
actually mate is proof that, please.
I am so glad you said that, because, we've had a lot of hard questions that have been emailed in. And that was one of the questions. Somebody said, are we to our detriment creating all these categories? And, aren't we all just human, child of God at the surface level? And I think your story addresses that very issue, is that, yes, it is a big deal what we're talking about, because we are at the very fundamental level children of God, and we're all human.
Matt, thanks so much for that question. I really believe that race is a fiction. It's an artificial category. It does not exist theologically. It does not exist scientifically. There's more difference within so-called races than there are between so-called races. Race is a fiction. However, racism is a fact, and it is a sin. And so it's one of the reasons we still need to talk about it. Sometimes people say, just to your point, Matt, they say, why do we have to talk about it so much? If we stop talking about it, maybe it would just go away. That is the same thing as saying, if we stop talking about I don't know, pick something, substitute something, if we stop talking about cancer, if we stop talking about opioid addiction, if we stop talking about any other societal problem, that's not going to make it go away. Racism is a reality, and I believe it's a sin. How is it a sin? Because it begins with the recognition that our world has departed, devastatingly departed, from God's divine design for humans. And so the relationships that we have tend not to be right between us and our creator, between us and the creation itself. We see that showing up in environmental issues that we have, between us and our own selves. I mean, some of us really struggle with our own selves. There is actually another category of racism called internalized racism, which I believe is one of the contributors to so-called black on black crime. And I'd like to talk about that maybe at some future point, or someone may want to ask about that. And then finally—
Well, I think somebody already has asked about that one, John. So I'm glad that you're going to bring that up.
Of course. That's one of the go-tos whenever anything happens to black people. People say, well, what about black on black crime? And so you want to talk about it now, Matt, or you want to bring it up later?
You know more than me how much time that one needs. So
okay.
We may have to say later, but we know, hey, we're going to address that one.
Okay, so, we'll park that for now. So the sin of racism leads to all sorts of, so if you think about internalized racism, maybe I'll deal with it a little bit now. So internalized racism is when a people or a group of people are hated and know they've been hated. And they've either been told explicitly or implicitly, which is as dangerous, been told implicitly that they're not as good, that they won't make it, that they are destined to be, the wretched of the earth, to quote a book written by Frantz Fanon, or to be thugs, or to assume certain roles. And self-fulfilling prophecy begins to happen. In other words, the way you treat people often is the way they then begin to act. And I believe that one of the contributors to so-called black on black crime is the internalization of feelings of self-hatred. It's really interesting though, Matt, because 85% of white people who get murdered in the United States of America get murdered by other white people. And I never hear anybody say white on white crime. So that's just kind of interesting to me. Another thing about this is that it presumes that black people living in black communities don't care about black on black crime. Now, I can't speak for all black people. Nobody can speak for all of any kind of people. But think about this. There are block clubs and associations and churches and all kinds of community groups that are working to fight this kind of scourge of black on black crime. But I think to go to black on black crime immediately after something bad happens to a black person is a dishonest approach. So
yeah, I think, it sounds to me, John, like a question that's used to now I know in the intent it was written, it was definitely a serious question, but I think sometimes it's a go-to question if we want to dodge the deeper issue.
Yeah, I mean, so I think Black Lives Matter means that Black lives in the womb matter. But to be pro-life means to be more than just anti-abortion. It means to pay attention to life everywhere. Remember, so-called black on black crime is an American problem. It's not just like a black people's problem over there. These people who are killing each other are African Americans living in the United States of America, where policing is already problematic or negligible in some cases. Or the old adage used to be in some communities: if you want to get the police to come quickly in a black community, do something to a white person. Many people say that white people are actually safer in black communities than black people are in black communities. But I want to just stick at a high level if I could for now, Matthew. So what is this thing about sin? Sin means to be in a Christian understanding. It comes from St. Augustine, to be radically turned in on oneself, to be incur se ipsum. So to be turned in on your own tribe, on your own people. And tribalism, I guess, is a good thing when you're on the Serengeti plain and you're trying to fend off like saber-toothed tigers and trying to figure out who is in your tribe and who is a threat and who is, but it doesn't work well in a pluralistic society, which is where we find ourselves in the United States of America. So where do we start? Of course, we start with our hope, who is Jesus Christ, the hope for all humanity, the one who gave his life to die for us and to die for all humans, because God so loved the world. And so that's where we start. We don't start with kind of false premises. And oftentimes, I think there are false premises we go to. And we see this showing up sometimes in some movements that believe they can create a different kind of society. So I'll just get a bit more theological here. St. Augustine is someone I like to talk about. And he said that there's basically two major and regrettably common mistakes that we make when we face challenges, like the challenges that we face around pluralism or immigration or diversity, or all these things that we face and challenge us. He says the first mistake is what he calls the lure of utopianism. And this is a mistake of thinking that we can produce a human society that will solve all of our problems and bring about the kingdom of God on earth. And according to Timothy George, this was the basic error of both Marxism and 19th century liberalism. And the other error, equally disastrous, is cynicism. And this creeps up on us as we see an ever-present evil. In fact, I was with someone not long ago, and he said, as we watch these days the collapse of Western civilization, I think that's an overstatement, and it's a sign of cynicism. And we withdraw into our own self-contained circle of contentment, which can just as well be a pious holy huddle as a secular skeptics club. So I think we have to avoid both extremes, both a utopianism, we cannot create heaven on earth, and a cynicism on the other hand, which just says, let's just withdraw. And actually there's a book out called The Benedict Option, and let's just go back into our own circle and forget about the world. This is my son, John Jr. He's an athlete, was a Division I college athlete. And this is his wife, Sarah. She's the daughter of two Lutheran elementary school teachers. And this is their son, John III. I like that, John Arthur Nunes III. And so I'd like you to read, if you have a few moments at some point, to go to either my Facebook page or Sarah's Facebook page. And she posted something on June 4th about her experience and about what she has seen being married to my son. And I think you might find it very interesting. I have certain privileges that my son does not have. I'm a lighter skinned person than my son is, and he has privileges. I have privileges that he doesn't have. And he has been profiled a number of times by police officers who have pulled him over. Of course, profiling is a real thing. And the next point I want to make here, Matt, is that profiling is real and that privilege is real. And I want to just dive into both of those categories because I know those are really big categories. So profiling.
Yeah, if you can share that, that would be huge. And then Susan also will, she'll find that Facebook post that you're talking about and share that in the chat as
awesome.
well.
Oh, great. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, it's I think it was shared a number of times. It shows up in a number of different pages and places, but June 4th is the date. Thank you, Susan. So profiling is a law enforcement strategy used to identify likely criminals, and it's based on outward characteristics. In other words, he looks like a bad man. And so my son has run into by the way, he has no criminal record. One time he was pulled over for an unpaid parking ticket, and it took 4 police cars to pull him over. And when they approached the car, the first thing they said to him was, "You are under arrest." That's the first thing they said to him. It was obviously a mistake that they had made. Once they discovered who he was, namely he has the same name as I do, and his driver's license has the same address as we do, and they realized he was the son of a college president, they reduced whatever it was that they had to a misdemeanor. When he got home, I called the local police chief and I said, "This happened to my son." He says, "Let me give you a phone number you can call and they'll take care of everything." And that's what privilege is. Privilege is a special power or opportunity or immunity that is granted to one group of people, especially as contrasted with another group of people. And so in this case, I want to suggest that both profiling is real and privilege is real. And by the way, notice I don't call it white privilege. It's privilege. It's more of a power-based privilege. I have privilege as an educated, lighter-skinned person, as a college president. I have privilege. I have privileges that my own son doesn't have. Now, one of the first places people go when they talk about privilege is to a kind of place of shame or a place of guilt. Like, you should feel bad about this. And I take a different approach. I believe that privilege is something that we have been given in order to be leveraged for the sake of others. In other words, as a stewardship opportunity. That's why we have privilege. I actually use Martin Luther, and he has this quote that I like a lot. He says, "For you are powerful, not that you may make the weak weaker by oppression, but that you may make them powerful by raising them up and defending them." And so the privilege that we have is an opportunity to do good in the world. So when Christians say, what can I do? Well, just first acknowledge that some people don't have the privileges that you do. I acknowledge that. If I can acknowledge that, by the way, I think many more of us can acknowledge that. And acknowledge that profiling is real. Some people actually get targeted. My own son gets targeted. I mean, he's been pulled over dozens of more times than I have for driving in nice neighborhoods, and people thought he didn't belong there, I guess. So this is a real thing.
That's really helpful that you say that, John, because people are, a big question that I've seen over and over and over coming in is, what can we do? Insert the blank. We're an almost all white church. I'm a 74-year-old white woman. Like, what can I do? And so something I hear you saying right there is maybe take stock of what privilege you do have and how you can use that privilege to the benefit of those around you.
You're really good. That's a great summary. I wish I would have said it that well. That's exactly right. Of course, we have I believe, a special opportunity in the United States of America. I'm actually going to jump this slide. We have an opportunity because we are the most diverse. One of the reasons we even have this discussion today is because we are one of the most diverse societies that has ever existed in the history of the planet. I mean, New York, where we live, Matt, the greater New York area is 20 million people and 800 different languages. It is the most diverse megalopolis on the planet. There are lots of big cities on the planet, but the demography is pretty much the same. Here in New York, we don't have a homogeneous demography. We've got all different kind of people from everywhere. And I believe that this is a blessing and this is an opportunity for the church, that God is actually up to something with this. In other words, God doesn't do these things by mistake. God did not choose the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea to be the place of the first coming of Jesus by mistake. That wasn't a coincidence. God chose that place 2,000 years ago for the coming of Jesus because it was a place that was at the intersection of where worlds meet. It was a place where Asia and Africa and Asia Minor, Africa and Europe, it was a crossroads kind of place. And the United States is very much that sort of place. And I believe that this is an opportunity for us. Kenneth Pruitt, who headed the US Census Bureau 20 years ago, had the quote of the day on January 1st, namely that the 21st century, this century in which we find ourselves, in which we redefine ourselves, we will in the United States be the first country in world history which is literally made up of every part of the world. And I believe that for Christians, this is an opportunity to embrace. This is a chance for us to grow the mission of Christ in the world. The United States, of course, has changed. When I was born, when George Wallace spoke around 1960, the United States was 88% white. The United States is now 44% white by 2060. That's the expectation. So that's clearly the path in which we're heading. This is an enormous shift in terms of demography. And perhaps only in the United States could you succeed in that kind of shift. But I believe it gives the people of God an opportunity to lead in this place in which we find ourselves. Matt, you're smiling. You got something you want to add?
Yeah, you're that image right there, 88% white, 1960, and 2060, 44% white. It just kind of reminds me how often our categories are relative. And the categories we use to even have these conversations right now, they won't even apply then, because the people that are the so-called majority now will be the minority statistically.
Well, majority and minority are very interesting terms to me. I mean, the people we call minority constitute 87% of the world's population. So that's just something interesting to think about, that the majority of people on our planet are so-called minorities. Yeah, but you're exactly right. These categories really do fall short. So I believe that if we can confront directly this sin of racism, it will give us an opportunity to engage in mission that is much more meaningful and powerful. Now, I want to talk about the confrontation of this sin, because I think the sin shows up in a multiplicity of ways. And we often like to just kind of categorize a certain kind of people as racist. And so I have developed something, and actually Bill Swirla, who's a pastor out in California, he gave me the title for what I developed. It's called a taxonomy of racism, a taxonomy of racism. So what I want to do is I want to talk about conservative racism, moderate racism, and progressive racism. And I want to suggest that these all kind of manifest themselves in different sorts of ways, but they lead to equally negative results in each case. So first, conservative racism is kind of really easy to spot, right? Kind of red meat, raw, rebel flag flying, cultural supremacists, okay? Everyone's kind of against them. They're really easy to spot. Okay, yeah, we're against that. Okay, a little bit more difficult is moderate racism, the kind of racist who says, I don't see race. And I want to suggest that is its own kind of racism. And I'm going to get to that, explaining it in a moment. And then there is also progressive or so-called liberal racism. And that shows up as the soft bigotry of low expectations, to quote Michael Gerson. And he was a speechwriter for George Bush, and George Bush actually used this phrase. And so as an educator, I want to make sure that we keep our standards and our expectations high for all people. I mean, we can't take it as an excuse. Well, these people, they just come from this community, so they're just doing the best that they can do. That is a kind of racism. It's kind of paternalism that leads also to a negative result. Conservative racists, please.
I think too, while you're on this slide, something interesting also to think about is I think sometimes we even put those categories in, well, the progressive or the moderate, we'll be able to reach them with the gospel and maybe they can change, but the conservative racist is never going to change. And I think I'm reminded of going to my mentor's church plant, Greg Burst down in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And there was a guy at his church. He had a huge tattoo on his back calf of like a monster, and the whole inside mouth was black. And so we were asking him about it. And he said, well, I had this huge swastika on the back of my calf when I was in jail. And he was actually the leader of the Aryan nation in jail and came to Christ and couldn't have the tattoo removed. So he had it covered up. And now this guy who would fall beyond the conservative, spectrum of racism is now so changed by the gospel. He's in a small group Bible study and brothers in Christ with a black man, and they study the Bible together.
Praise God. The conservative is, in some ways, might know he's a racist much more than a moderate or progressive would. And of course, acknowledgement of sin is the first step on the way to the amendment of a sinful life. So you're right, there might be a better chance there. But when we bring up topics of racism, a conservative racist will say, Jan, do we have to talk about this again? If we stop talking about it, maybe it'll just go away. Okay, why do we have to talk about this all the time? A moderate will say, racism is primarily an individual act or attitude. So if I haven't committed that act or attitude, then I'm not guilty of any racism because I haven't done anything. Okay, so I think it misses what Jesus talks about, where he talks about sin as more than just an individual action. Jesus talks about sin in thought, word, and deed. And Jesus talks about sin also in terms of systems or structures of sin. So a progressive only sees racism, or primarily sees racism, as embedded in systems and in structures. A conservative will tend to dismiss the other and not even take the time to listen. By the way, I do think that what we have now in the United States of America is a listening moment. And what I pray is that we don't squander this moment, because people are really, their hearts are really open to hear and to learn and to try to figure out how we can deal with this. So this is a listening moment, and we ought not just dismiss one another during this time. A moderate will say, well, I can tolerate them, kind of with an eye roll, but okay, they're here, but I can tolerate them. And progressive racism tends to fetishize the other. Now that's kind of an interesting word. It's an irrational exuberance for the other. It's like, I just love those people because of the way they sing and the way they dance and their accents. They have such beautiful accents. You almost make the other into an idol. So that's kind of a kind of progressive racism. So this is what I want to suggest as a kind of taxonomy of racism, something for us just to think about as a category. John Hope Franklin, as you probably know, was the most preeminent African-American historian who probably has ever lived in the United States of America. And he tells a story that I want to use to illustrate the point about people who say, I don't see race. Okay, he tells a story when he was 15 years old, and he was an Eagle Scout, Boy Scout, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is where he's from. And he was helping a white lady who was blind to cross the street. He saw her and he wanted to do his good deed of the day. And so he was helping her across the street. And somewhere, as they were making their way across the street, she came to recognize that he actually was an African-American kid. And she said to him, using the parlance of that time, "Are you a colored child?" And he puffed his chest out very proudly and he says, "Well, yes, ma'am, I am," because he thought she was kind of commending him. And it turned out that she said, "Can you please take your dirty hands off of me? I do not want you helping me." And of course, he walked away very sad because he was trying to figure out why this woman had treated him like this. But did I mention that did I mention she was a blind lady?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she saw race. So, I mean, so it's not about whether or not you see. Of course you see what's in front of you. It's what you do with what you see that matters. It would be like me saying when I met my wife, a beautiful woman, that I did not see gender. I guarantee you I saw gender. I still see gender when I see my wife, okay? But I see more than that. Of course I see more than that because I love her for the person she is, not only for the gender that she is. I love her for the whole person that she is. So, but I would suggest the better way to say it is, yeah, I see it, but here's what it means to me, or here's how I see past it. So it's not what you see that matters in the other. It's what you do with what you see that really matters. And of course, St. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 that we are new creations in Christ. And as new creations in Christ, we no longer regard others according to the flesh, katasarx, according to their outward phenotype. Okay, we don't regard them according to that. Is there still Jew and Greek? Yes, there is. Is there still slave and free? Of course, there's labor class, management class. Is there still male or female? Of course there is. But it's what you do with it as a Christian now that makes the difference. You now see people through the lens of Jesus Christ. As a friend of mine used to say, we see them cross-eyed, right? We see them through the lens of Jesus Christ, through the cross. Now, where do we start? I want to get really practical now, just as I conclude. Where do we start? I want to suggest that we start by understanding that engaging in questions of diversity is not merely just flipping a switch. It's not like I can turn a light on and suddenly everything will be figured out. Think of it this way. You know, the COVID environment in which we find ourselves, those institutions, organizations, churches, schools that are doing well in this COVID environment are schools that in the pre-COVID environment figured out a way to use technology meaningfully. Here at Concordia College, New York, we did. We had many of our professors who were using a blended or a hybrid format for teaching even before COVID hit. And if you were doing that before COVID hit, you're going to do well through COVID and then in the new norm after COVID. So I want to use that by analogy to describe the George Floyd situation. If you were doing stuff about diversity and talking about diversity before this recent thing hit, you're gonna figure out a way to get through this, and you're gonna do well as we get through it. If you weren't, then you got to realize you got a lot of work to do. It's not just flipping a switch. It's not just 5 quick tips or 7 easy steps to be a highly diverse community. That's not the way this works. Concordia College, New York, had its first African-American student in 1910. He graduated in 1912. I know you don't see race, but he's actually in this photograph. He's in the upper right-hand corner. You can see him there. I'm sorry.
If you need us to point him out for you.
That was a cheap shot. I'm sorry. That was very sarcastic. I apologize. But it goes to the point. Of course you know who he is, okay? So his name was Charles Stoll. And Charles Stoll graduated in 1912 from Concordia College. And he went on to seminary in St. Louis. And when he went to the seminary, then that seminary did not admit him. They said, we won't admit you. You must go to the colored seminary in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is where he then went to school and did well through the course of his life. Concordia College is a place I believe that does well on questions of diversity because we've been at it for a long time. For example, we don't have any, Black students organizations or Latino students organizations or any of those kind of groups. And people like that. They say, how can we get to a place where we don't have to have those groups? Well, we've been at this work for a long, long time. I am not the first non-white president at Concordia College. I am the first president of African-American descent in Lutheranism of a college, but I'm not except for Concordia College Selma, a historically Black college, but I'm not the first president here in this school. So I want to suggest some practical ways we can get at this question and this problem. Okay, so I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One is this: to think of your approach as one by one from the inside out. In other words, it's about relationships. It's about getting to know people. It's about listening to people. Okay, and it's starting with one individual person. And someone might say, well, I don't know people. I don't have Black people in my church. I don't have Hispanic people in my community. How can I get to know people? Again, sorry for being sarcastic, but Al Gore invented this thing called the internet. And you can actually get to know people on the internet. One by one, you can get to know them. And they have, you can direct message them even and kind of have a conversation. And let's just say it goes bad. It's awesome, because on the internet, on these social media platforms, you can block them forever and you're done with them. And it's awesome. So if it goes bad, right? So take the risk, take the chance to get to know people, to actually talk to other humans who are not like you. Be intentional about it. And how do we make change? From the inside out. I don't believe it's about a violent revolution. And I renounce and denounce people who are using violent means. It is not the way of Jesus Christ. But it is about systemic change. And the best way I believe that you bring about systemic change, and maybe it's because I'm a Lutheran, is you do it working within the church. Luther wanted to reform the church from within the church, not from outside of the church. So I believe it's a revolution of love, if you want to call it that, but it's from the inside. Get in the system, learn the language of the system, and then work to change the system from within. I've worked my entire life to try to do that. Second, be intentional about who's at the table. In other words, diversity won't just happen. People say, well, we're just hiring the best people. That's, by the way, another excuse. You're hiring the best people. No, you're hiring people who look like you and cook like you and walk like you and talk like you. And it's not a coincidence that they're all like you, or they're all like me, or they're all like whatever group there is. You have to be intentional about diversity, or it won't just happen. So I don't believe in quotas, by the way. I think quotas actually are mathematical formulas that are counterproductive, both to the person who gets tokenized and gets put at the table, and to the resentment that is created to those who are already at the table. Well, we know the only reason he's here is because he's the token guy here. So it doesn't happen with quotas, but it doesn't happen without intentionality. You have to be intentional about this. You have to take a look around and say, hey, who's not here, whose voice needs to be here? One of the quotes I like is, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu.
Oh.
Another quote I like is this: nothing about them without them. So if you want to design a program for somebody, they have to be there at the table as a part of the design. So be intentional about who is at the table. Number 3, I begin my courses with my students I still teach, because I think that presidents ought to be involved, administrators ought to be involved in the day-to-day activities of the institution. And I begin by asking them to tap themselves on the shoulders 6 times. So 1, 2, 3, you can do this at home, 4, 5, 6. What, Matt? 3, 4, 5, 6. And repeat after me. I don't know everything. I don't know everything. That's it. That's it. That's exactly it. So in other words, I have to be listening in order to learn. I do that with my students because oftentimes, maybe you've never met a 19 or 20-year-old, but sometimes they really think they know it all. Because, as Alexander Pope, the poet, says, a little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deeply or touch not the Pyrenean spring. For shallow draughts, knowing a little bit, intoxicates the brain. And drinking largely sobers us again. So it's around humility, intellectual humility, in dealing with people who are not like us. As you said, Matt, you might meet somebody who gets dismissed or excused as being just a redneck. Let me just throw that term out there, who turns out to be a different kind of person than you ever imagined. That's happened to me on any number of times. But you got to give them, you got to know that you don't know everything, and you don't know their history, and you don't know their story. So it takes time with people. Consider betraying your tribe. And what I mean by that is, we all know that when we're around, kind of our own people, stuff gets said that is not true. and we just kind of let it go. We don't challenge it.
Mhm.
You know, that happens in every group. I go to a barbershop, and stuff I hear in that barbershop, you know, many white people would not like it, okay? Because they feel it's a safe place that they could talk. But every now and then I'll challenge. I say, you know what? That's not true, man. That's not true. You got to betray your tribe sometimes, because you belong to a more transcendent tribe than just your local tribe that looks like you and cooks like you and walks like you and talks like you. You belong to another tribe. It's an eternal tribe. It's a heavenly tribe. So betray this earthly tribe for the sake of transcendent truth.
To your point, John, you know, if maybe somebody's like, oh, that kind of rubs me the wrong way, you know, Book of Acts, Paul does this with Peter, because Peter's acting one way when the Gentiles are in the room, and a completely different way when the Jews come in, and Paul calls him out on it. And so I think, you know, you've got a scriptural reference for why that considering betraying your tribe is such an important point.
Thank you, Peoples the Bible Man. Thank you so much, sir. Excellent. And then finally, convene conversations. No, fifth, convene conversations, which is exactly what you're doing here, Matt. Bring people together. I was on a call earlier today with the Lutheran Church Extension Fund, and I really credit the CEO, President and CEO, Bart Day, because he's convened a conversation of all of his staff, and a whole 100 showed up, and we're having really hard conversations around difficult topics. Bring people together. We here at the college have something once a year we call Dialogues on the Quad, where we do exactly this. We go right to the heart of difficult conversations, but convene a conversation and have people there from a variety of perspectives, and make sure that the conversation is respectful and it's civil, and it doesn't engage in ad hominem or straw man arguments, straw people arguments. But convene conversations. Churches can really do this. Churches can convene conversations better than anybody, because churches are trusted entities still in communities. And then finally, do something with food. Food is phenomenal. Learn other people's food. That's a great place to start. And by the way, you can pray, because we give thanks for this food. We can pray, right? So you start with prayer, and you can have lots of laughter over food, and you can bring people. Food is multi-generational. People of every age and every stage of life like food. So consider food as another way to get at this issue and question and problem. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, Matt, and let's go to the dialogue. I'm sorry for going so long. I've got so much I want to share.
This is phenomenal.
I've been waiting like 30 years for this. I've been waiting 30 years for this. I've been talking about this for a long time, so I really do appreciate us having this conversation.
This is huge. I'll have Susan kill the screen share for us, and we'll just start dialoguing here, because we've had a ton of questions come in. Some you've kind of hit, but we can even just address the question specifically. And some that are going to overlap. So maybe you've asked a question here. It might overlap with somebody else's question. So just kind of be aware of that as we're digging in. But I want to start with this one. Paul asks, how does the church add to the division of the human race?
Oh, what a great question. What a fabulous question.
Which also ties into another question, John, while you're thinking about this one. Somebody said, you know, what do we say to those evangelical churches that say the races shouldn't mix?
Yeah, well, yeah. All right, so let's deal with the first one first. So I think churches add to division by making temporary things, penultimate things, secondary things into permanent things, into ultimate things, by not carefully spending time to figure out what is theological here, what is biblical here, and what is cultural, and what is just kind of who we are and what our people like and what I like. I, for example, think that at every church, you ought to be singing songs that you don't like. So if you're only singing songs that you like, what is that about? I mean, the church should be Catholic. The church should be universal. The church should be understanding that, you know, it's not just about us and our time and our place, but it's God's people of all times and all places. And we ought to be singing a variety of songs. And I think music is one of the ways that we can easily show that the church is just kind of pandering in many cases to what people like and are comfortable with, and not challenging people in their own kind of faith development.
You know, John, I'm glad you brought that up because I experienced this at the last Exponential conference. For those of you that aren't familiar, Exponential is like a huge church planting conference. And in past years, they've had a diverse crowd, but when you were listening to music from the stage, it was very one generational
Yep.
and almost stylistically very one style. This year, they blew the doors off. We went from a Hillsong tune to an African spiritual and anything and everything in between. And it was amazing because what I noticed in that room was by having that diversity of music, as small as that may sound to some people, it brought more people together. You could hear people singing out that would have never sung out. It stretched you in your understanding, even if it was just to remember that, hey, the church is bigger than my little world and my little bubble, just through the music that we selected.
You know, the great command, love your neighbor. Well, how can you love your neighbor and you not like his music? Or hate his music? I mean, so you're exactly right. So I think we all ought to sing songs that we maybe are not immediately comfortable with and learn a variety of traditions. So that's one of the ways anyway. And it goes to the question of theology and culture. The second part of the question was, what was the second part? How?
Yeah, what do you say to the evangelical churches that
well, you say,
maybe try to
that's
pop
easy.
up that false idea that the races shouldn't mix, or let's just say that's one. What do you say to the churches that are trying to use their theology to prop up things that shouldn't be propped up?
So convene a conversation. That's what I say. Convene a conversation. Hear where they're coming from. I mean, it obviously starts with listening, but then it starts with listening and then pivoting. So you don't just end with listening. You listen, and then you pivot. But you got to begin where they are. I mean, it depends on what you want to do to them. If you want to condemn them, or if you want to, convert them to like truth. Mm-hmm. So yeah, are there still churches that say that explicitly?
It's funny you say that because when I was in the South, I planted a church in Knoxville, Tennessee. We used to take texted in questions. And the question got texted in. I had several couples that were from different racial backgrounds, and they said, "Could you address this question?" Because in their experience, it was still laid out that way at times in churches.
Well, I'll tell you, when I went to Concordia, Ann Arbor, as I mentioned, and filled out that census form, I was involved in a late evening conversation. I still remember the names of the people with whom I was involved in that conversation. I won't say the names to protect the guilty, but I've kept track of these guys. And they had a long conversation with me, and they said, I'm not going to say that your parents' marriage was a sin, but they did kind of violate the fourth commandment by not honoring the legacy of their own fathers and mothers and their own people groups. So I think that attitude does show up in many ways, not only in the evangelical churches, but maybe even in some of our own churches. So how do you change anybody? I mean, law and gospel. I mean, I don't think there's any quick tricks. I think it's around preaching, it's around the word of God. And the Holy Spirit finally brings the change.
Which brings up a really great question for me, because if you're going to have hard conversations, you're going to step on toes. Like, I'm hearing that question that was presented to you. And I know that question was hard to hear, and to even be able to sit down and have the conversation, you probably had to check a little bit of your offense at the door to even be able to stay engaged with the conversation. So how do we do that well? How do we sit down and be willing to have a conversation and work past the offense or the accidental offense of the conversations that will come?
That is a fabulous question, Matt. So we know that the patience of God is our salvation. We're not saved unless God is long-suffering with us. And so we at least owe that to others. So if I can tell a really raw story, not long ago, I was out with my wife, and we were at dinner with someone, and we were attempting to, it was a donor call because I'm a president of a college. And we were talking to this person, and he says, people always ask me why I don't have any Black members in my church. And I tell him, of course I can get Black members if I wanted to. And I said, well, where could you get them from? He says, well, we get them from, he said, and I apologize if I'm offending anybody, we get them from Hertz Renenigger. And when he said that, my wife drove her heel. If you know Monique, you know what I'm talking about. Drove her
Yeah.
heel into my shin and said, you know, like, say something, do something. And I chose not to. I chose not to respond. I thought I misheard him. And so I said, excuse me? And he he said the same thing, N-word. So we finished the meal, we came home, and my wife said, well, why didn't you say something to him? I said, well, because I was angry. And I knew I was angry, and it wasn't the right time. I needed some space between what he said, but I promise you I'll follow up with it. So the next time I went to see him, I went without my wife, which was a good decision. And I went out there and just man to man, I said, and he said to me, he says, you know, he says, you're the first person who's ever challenged me on that joke. Everybody thinks it's funny. I said, everybody? Who is everybody? He says, well, all the pastors I talked to about that joke, they all think it's hilarious. And I said, well, let me just tell you something about it. It's not hilarious. It's, in fact, it was crushing. It crushed my wife. It's hurtful to me to hear that. And it doesn't befit you as a man of God to use language like that. I said, you know, you're compromising your own dignity when you do that. And he began to weep. He said, I'm very sorry. He said, I'm so sorry. I said, you're forgiven, but you just got to know that. So I think in our culture, we live in a call out culture, right? Where someone says something or does something wrong, and then we foreclose on that, and we call the person out, and we say, this person is a racist, or this person is anti-Semite. And we don't keep in the tension of the relationship. And to your point, Matt, the Holy Spirit has no place to work unless you stay in the tension of the relationship. Keep the relationship open, even if it's hurtful and harmful and stuff you don't want to hear and stuff you don't like to hear. And I believe that's one of the ways in which we heal this breach, is that we exercise the same fruit of the Spirit called patience towards others that God has exercised towards us for the sake of our salvation. Forgive us as we forgive those who trespass against us. It's really as simple as that. And people will make mistakes and they will say stupid things. And it's not about calling them out or about, you know, labeling them as a this or a that, but it's about staying in relationship. And by the way, he's leaving the school $1 million.
That's awesome. No, and I'm glad you share that story because, you know, one of the real challenges I've seen, and one of the real challenges I had to wrestle with as well, is we do live in this immediate response culture. And we think that every offense demands this immediate and not even thought out kind of response. And so I love the example you gave us, because you showed us an example that I think would be important for a lot of people to implement when it comes to their use of social media, when it comes to us standing up and speaking on behalf of the church. I knew that we needed to talk about injustice and racism in our church, but I also knew I needed time to think about what that needed to sound like. And so I like that your response was, I'm going to respond to this, but I'm going to make sure that when I respond to this, I'm able to do this in a Christ honoring way. And so I think, you know, tell me if I'm hearing you right. We can at times put the pause button on our reaction if we're willing to pick it up later, and not just let it kind of slide.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's pastors who need to do this. I saw one pastor on here saying he refused communion to people for using terms that are stupid. It actually prompted in my mind a story. If I can tell another story, Matt, that makes this point.
Yeah.
There was a pastor, I know his name, I know the church, I won't say them. It was in the city of Detroit, and his first African-American family began to visit the congregation in the 1960s. They went to the day school, and they decided they wanted to join the congregation, and they had a meeting with the pastor, and they would have been the first Black family to join this congregation. And the pastor said to them, well, you can join, but you just can't come to communion yet, you know, because communion is, you know, if you could just sit in the pew and not come to communion. So he met with his elders, and he said, you know, this family, they want to join our church. I actually know the name of the family. I know some of their grandchildren. And he said, they want to join our church, but I told them they can join, but they can't have communion yet because we can't have them at the communion rail with us. And the elders of that church said to that pastor, well, you can be a pastor, but you can't be one at this church. So I think sometimes it's the laity that need to, speak truth to clergy, because clergy are, they need to call them out. So that's an example. I saw someone on the thread here said, you have to make people feel uncomfortable at times. I mean, that's what the law does to us. It breaks us and it exposes us, and it serves as a mirror and shows us who we really are. And some of who we really are, we don't like. It's hard to see who we really are. And that's part of what's going on right here in the United States these days, where maybe we're saying, are we really that bad? Are we really? We thought we'd come so far. So it's hard. This is a hard moment we find ourselves in.
So, to that, one of the big questions that was on everybody's mind, in fact, I'm reading, Ted's got this question, Charlie's got this question. Can you speak to, once again, I know we addressed it a little bit in the beginning, but could you speak to the Black Lives Matter movement and the statement Black Lives Matter, and just, speak to that
Sure.
more specifically?
So in the first place, I am still trying to figure this thing out myself. Okay. So I'm not the answer man, and B, I'm still wrestling with this myself. Okay. Because there are elements of the Black Lives Matter movement that I find very, very problematic. Okay. Very problematic. I just want to be on the record. This past Sunday, I participated in a march, and was it a Black Lives Matter march? I don't know. It was Christian leaders from a variety of faith traditions. As we marched, we sang songs. This Little Light of Mine was one of the songs we sang. So Christian songs were even among the songs that we sang. People were shouting, Black Lives Matter. That was part of so Black Lives Matter was kind of a slogan that was used. We were escorted by police. It was in the Washington Heights section of Manhattan. When we got to the end, there was a sort of prayer vigil at the end, and we prayed. We prayed for families that have lost people due to violence. And then we prayed for the police who escorted us. And you should have seen their response. I mean, they were thanking us and saying, thank you for. So I believe that we were a witness to peaceful protest, to making a statement. I believe we were a witness to a constructive way of speaking out and making ourselves known. I had my collar on. People saw that we were clearly from the church. They saw we were clearly praying. We had megaphones, or what do they call those, bullhorns, when we were praying. So they clearly heard that these were Christian prayers in the name of Jesus. I believe it was a public witness that was positive. There were people carrying Black Lives Matter signs. Now, Black Lives Matter is a very, very complicated thing. So it is many things. It's a hashtag. It's a slogan that people use. It is the best description for the 21st century civil rights movement. If you think about the civil rights movement in the 1960s, it was more than just Martin Luther King Jr. It was Stokely Carmichael, and it was Malcolm X, and it was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Coalition, SNCC, and it was the NAACP, and it was the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It was all of these groups, it was a confederation of groups. And Black Lives Matter is the same thing. It's a confederation of groups. So here's where I'm wrestling. If the church decides, and if Christians decide, we don't want to be involved in this, what's going to happen to the Black Lives Matter movement? In other words, will it be that there's no Christian presence at all? And I don't think that's a good thing. So this is a matter of, in our theology, we're not the church, we're in the world, it's on the left hand. And sometimes in the world, you can sign up with co-belligerents, with whom you do not 100% agree, to get good done in the world. And I believe at the end of the day, I believe it today, maybe next week it'll change, or the week after, but as of today, I believe still more good is being done than bad is being done. And I don't have to agree with everything in order to be a part of it. I mean, I don't agree with everything Martin Luther said. What Martin Luther said about the Jews, I don't agree with. What Martin Luther said about the peasants, what he said about the Pope, some of the things he said about the Pope, like unscrewing the Pope's head and urinating into the cavity, I don't agree with that statement.
Yeah.
But I'm proud to be connected to the Lutheran tradition. So I don't think you have to have complete consensus with people to be a co-belligerent with them for the sake of a better cause. Now, maybe by next week, the scales will have tipped so much that we can't work with them or walk with them. But as of today, I think it's still a good thing.
Well, and I think it's helpful that you put it in that category. You know, I think a lot of times we're thinking of the Black Lives Movement matters as one organized group, you know, with like a head and a doctrine and all this kind of stuff. And that's not the case. It's this coalition of people that are riding under a banner that we would have to, as Christians, say is absolutely true. Black lives do matter. And to your point, Matt Littikanen, you know, kind of tags onto this question. I love how he put it. The gospel is a systematic answer to a systematic problem, but how do we avoid the temptation to respond to our racialized culture using only the talking points of the right or the left?
Yeah, there's a group called the And campaign, that really, you see, so if your faith aligns, so think about this, your faith, which is, 2,000 years old and global and worldwide, and if it aligns only with the left wing of the Democratic Party, and if there's no difference between your faith and the plank of the left wing of the Democratic Party, then I say there's something wrong with your faith. And I would say that also applies to Christians on the right. If there is like no gap between what you believe and what the right wing of the Republican Party believes, then there's a problem. For example, when I say Black Lives Matter, I happen to be pro-life, okay? So I'm a supporter. I've spoken at LFL, Lutherans for Life events, and we have 6 kids. I believe this, okay? And I think that one of the places where Black lives are under siege is in the womb. So I'll go out there and say that. I also believe that if you look at incarceration rates in the United States of America, that's one of the places where especially Black males are clearly under siege. I mean, we have incarceration rates that are shameful in terms of compared to the rest of the world. So we have not taken seriously enough, especially the lives of Black males. When 1 out of every 3 Black males is either on probation, parole, or in prison, and you have more Black males who are incarcerated than you have in university and college, that's a crisis as a nation. That's a national crisis. So Black Lives Matter does not mean to say other lives don't matter. It simply means to say, we've got a problem here that we have to address as a nation. And what I love about the movement is that, and we saw this when we were marching this past Sunday, is there are people from every race and every background who are part of this movement. I mean, Dominicans and lots of Latinos, and a new term I learned was, Black Latinos. Blatinos is the term. Yeah, all right. And white people, all kinds of folk are a part of this. And I think that's actually a sign of hope. And I'd like to see the church in the middle of it, not just, criticizing it and standing at the outside and throwing in rocks. Are there problems with the movement? Absolutely, there are problems with the movement. But as I said, it's one by one from the inside out. So let's work within it to redeem it.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point you're making, because I think the problem is we're too silent in the conversation. And we do, and I told our church this, we have the best tools to deal with injustice and racism, because Christ gives them to us. They're simple, but they're not simplistic. They deal with the depth of our humanity and our brokenness. And I think the problem is, I think sometimes we take for granted that we have these tools. And then we watch on the news as people are reeling against the brokenness in our world, and they're trying to bring the tools they have to bear on it. And then we almost judge and criticize the tools they bring, forgetting the fact that they don't have any better tools to bring. And the people that have better tools to bring, the church, is not bringing the tools.
Yeah, we're silent. Yeah, exactly.
So I think, man, as I said, we might have to do follow-ups. I'm sorry, but we have so many questions that have popped in here. But I guess
I really like. Can I jump in here? I was just looking at James Sharp. Greetings, James Sharp. Good brother. And he's making a distinction between Black Lives Matter capital B and Black Lives Matter lowercase b, like Catholic and Catholic. As a kind of equivalent distinction. There's a lot of truth to that, because there actually is an organization called blacklivesmatter.org, which is attempting to co-opt the name of the movement. So that's a really good point. So the closer you get to something and the more you know someone, the more you're able to engage in nuance and realize that all of everything is not alike. And that's one of the reasons that it's this formula of one by one. It's actually getting to know people. You know, if you don't know classical music, for example, you might say it all sounds the same. But the more you know it, the more you realize that Baroque is different than Beethoven, is different than Brahms, is different than, you know, you begin to make the nuances. The closer you get to something, the more you can learn to love that thing and actually respect that thing and understand that that thing is not a monolith. And so that's why I believe that, you know, it is in these kind of relationships that we build. It's in these conversations that we have. And I really commend you, Matt, for convening this exciting group today.
Well, and I love, because you've talked about, and you've said it over and over, and I think it's important, you know, change begins within and within our organization. But I think Kirk Nuggebauer's got a really great question here. He says, could you speak to our vocation in the civil realm when it comes to proposed legislation, which is intended to curb some of these injustices? To what extent should we utilize our authorities to create a just society?
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a great question. So the civil realm, we should be, well, you know, I think one of the perils of Lutheranism is its quietism. And I do think that we need to be engaged in the civil realm. The civil realm is a dangerous place to walk, but it's a necessary place to walk. And we have to be scalpel-like in the civil realm, not sledgehammer-like, and be very, very careful about the sorts of legislation that we get behind. But yeah, I would say absolutely to be engaged for the sake of our witness, for the sake of our public witness. And I believe we're called to. I believe that God is actually active in the civil realm, that the left hand of God is God's hand. It's not like God just works in the church and not in the world. In fact, sometimes I believe, I'll make this statement, that God is using the world to teach the church. And sometimes we've got as much to learn from the world. Jesus himself said the children of this age are wiser than the children of the light. We've got stuff we need to learn from the civic realm or the civil realm. And we need to be participants in the civil realm as well. And I believe, and then right now we have a great opportunity for a public witness, and that's what I don't want to squander.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad that you say that, because here's a question that I think gets at a deeper question, and I'll give you just a couple more questions. But as I'm giving you these questions, it was asked, you know, obviously we can't cover it all. This is just a conversation starter, and so we will share a PDF after this that's got the links we've talked about, resources we talked about. But I know it was asked, you know, what resources could we be looking at to better understand these issues from a Christ-centered perspective, or to better understand where the culture may sit with these issues. So if there's any resources you would recommend, you can think about that. We'll end on that one when we ask it. But I love Janelle Davis's question here, because I think it also goes to the broader question of maybe why we're sometimes too quiet, whether it be as Christians or as just individuals of a different race. But Janelle says, how do we respond to hurting people who bring up the racist history of the LCMS? And I think you could underline LCMS and exchange it with the white race, the Christian church, you know, how do we respond to hurting people who bring up the dark parts of our history?
Yeah, I mean, I think we respond to people with the same sort of compassion that we would respond to any kind of people who are hurting. The word compassion is a great word. It means to feel viscerally at the deepest level, and empathy is really a pathway for us through this. And people, you know, think about and to let people know that they're being heard and they're being listened to and they're being cared for. Bill Clinton once made an interesting statement. Of course, I disagree with lots of things that Bill Clinton said, but he was right on this one. Bill Clinton said once, a reporter, as reporters are prone to do, asked Bill Clinton a really stupid question. Bill, President Clinton, we've noticed that you're polling really well among, you know, minorities, and what is it that they like about you? Is it that, you know, you play the saxophone? What is it, Bill Clinton, that they like about you? And President Clinton gave this answer. I think this is a really profound answer, and it's so simple. He said, Bill Clinton said, I found out something about Black people. He said, they like people who like them. So at the end of the day, you know, people are really not that complicated. People know when they're being respected, and minorities, I'll tell you, have a radar, built-in radar, about who's treating them with respect or not. So one thing about you, Matt, and your family, you've always treated us with respect. We sat at the same table with you for a whole week at Camp Arcadia and got to know you, and it was respect. There was nothing between us. So I've always felt that way about you, but I've also not felt that way about a lot of folks, you know, who I've met. And you could just tell right from the beginning that there's something about you that they find deeply troubling. Well, maybe it's just a function of my personality. Maybe it's not how I look. Doesn't matter. The thing is that people know when they're being taken seriously, when they're being respected, and when they're loved genuinely. So I believe if someone comes forward with some hurt, it doesn't hurt to acknowledge the hurt and say, yeah, this is real. I understand that you have struggled. The church has made many mistakes. I mean, the great thing about being Lutheran is that we don't believe the church is a kind of a perfect divine institution. It's both human and divine. So in as much as the church is human, it's made lots of mistakes. And we can actually concede that and not give up the gospel. So I don't think, I don't see that as a problem. I mean, what should we be reading as the last question? And I really do have to run here. I've got another event coming up. But in the first thing, people always are, again, looking for the 5 quick tips, the 4 easy steps, the 7 highly effective habits. And I want to kind of disincline people from that because and take a long view approach. There is no magic bullet. There is no secret pill. There is no instantaneous solution. It's not like flipping the lights on. Okay, it's about just a commitment over time to people. Yes, read people like Alberto Garcia, who's someone with whom I've written. We've got this book called Wittenberg Meets the World, Reimagining the Reformation from the Margins. I think that might be a good read, but you might want to read Leo Sanchez, from St. Louis, has got some great stuff that he's been writing on this topic. There's a guy named Jamar Tisby. He's a Christian. He's written a book called The Color of Compromise. It's edgy, but I'd recommend Jamar Tisby. Read the 66 books that comprise your Holy Bible. That's a really good thing to read. You'll find lots of material in there that speak to this topic. But more than any of that, I think it's about talking to people. Read the human text, the people that you know. I'll tell you, I've been listening and learning a lot from my own children. We raised our children to believe that they would grow up into a kind of a post-racial society. I mean, all the signs were there. It seemed like things were getting better. We elected Barack Obama. It seemed like things were heading in a really kind of good direction. And our children are teaching us that there were many things we didn't prepare them for in this world that they are encountering. So, listen, we need to listen to 20-somethings and 30-somethings and listen to our children. I think they've got a lot of wisdom for us, and we don't lose anything by listening to those we love.
Wow. John, thank you so much. We're going to let John, if he needs to, jump off this because he's been doing a lot of calls. If you want to connect with any of the resources we talked about or with John himself, we're going to send out a follow-up PDF. Thank you all for having the conversation. Of course, if you're like, hey, you guys talked about a lot of stuff, but you didn't address this, this, and this, let us know. And hopefully we'll just schedule a follow-up to continue the conversation. But John, thank you for taking the time. If you guys want to watch this or share it with your churches, we've been streaming it on Facebook Live through the Kairos Network Facebook page. So you could share it directly to your church page from that if you want to share it with your people. We'll also send you an on-demand follow-up link. And you can use the same sign-up link you used in this to share the on-demand with other people so you can share the conversation out. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. John, thank you for being willing to have this conversation with us and allowing us to address this.
Thanks for your leadership, Matt. Blessings.
Thank you.